Want to see how fake news happens? I have a story for you to watch, and I'll get to it in a second. I think this story will be a great example of how disinformation spreads, and there are lots of ways fake news can gain traction. But reporting that looks and feels like fact-based information and even ties into current discussions is probably the most misleading. Let's create a timeline. Today is May 6, 2024, and for the past few weeks there have been many reports about France's president speaking about France's support for Ukraine. France is both a NATO member and a member of the EU. France takes part in the Ramstein format meetings and in February became part of a coalition supporting Ukraine's air defense capabilities. Russian state media has highlighted the fact that Emmanuel Macron has not firmly said that France will not ever send troops to Ukraine. This is called an argument from silence. Conclusions are drawn based on the absence of a statement, not the presence of one. The current context, with France supporting Ukraine in words and symbolic gestures, can allow disinformation to spread if it links to real situations and contexts. Remember, misinformation is false information shared without the intent to deceive. Disinformation is when false information is deliberately created and shared to deceive and manipulate. On May 4th, the Asia Times shared content with the headline, "France sends combat troops to Ukraine's battlefront." The subheader was a question. Will the deployment of a Foreign Legion unit commanded by French officers trigger a wider European war? This is a red flag. These headlines are part of what's known as Betteridge's Law of Headlines. The rule is basically that any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered simply with the word no. Headlines in the form of questions often imply something sensational or unfounded, and the question format allows attention-grabbing statements without committing to accuracy. Fake news stories need an initial platform to reach an audience. This is often done when stories are published on lesser-known or fringe websites that may not have stringent editorial standards. These websites might be dedicated to spreading a particular ideology or viewpoint, or simply to generating traffic with sensational content. Over the past 48 hours, this commentary from the Asia Times is being ceded to other smaller news outlets. Through amplification over social media, articles like this are often shared by groups who support the ideological slant of the story, and then the algorithms take over and prioritize content that generates engagement, often regardless of the content's factualness, although this is being addressed by some platforms in some ways now. Then bots and fake accounts may play a role in artificially amplifying the fake news stories by reposting, liking, and sharing them extensively. And then the story may be picked up by larger news outlets. Like on May 6th, when the Hindustan Times, based in Delhi, India, with a reported daily readership of over 1 million, quoted the Asia Times article. Once a story has reached larger outlets and is shared based on the assumption that the others did the heavy lifting of fact-checking, we have an echo chamber effect. A story gains legitimacy by being shared and discussed without sufficient critical scrutiny. The problem is that even if the story is later debunked, the original fake news article can continue to circulate and be believed. Corrections and retractions are proven to reach a smaller audience than the original story. On May 6th, if you searched French Foreign Legion in Ukraine, the first hit is the Asia Times article. This situation is a perfect storm for getting it wrong. The news look of the source, the missing context for what the French Foreign Legion is. It is a unit within the French army, but its members are not French, and some do leave the Legion to work as mercenaries, and some former Foreign Legion members are certainly in Ukraine, just like people with military experience from all over the world are. If France were to send its military into Ukraine to fight against Russia, France would be considered a belligerent under international law. A belligerent is a state that is formally participating in hostilities, taking direct military action in a conflict. Russia could justify responses like military action, economic sanctions, cyber warfare, and Russian support for opposing political movements inside of France. The last two, cyber warfare and Russian support for opposing political movements, are being investigated all over Europe right now. But the fake news could justify the actions and further polarize opinions in Europe. This article could be the start of a virtual false flag operation. Keep an eye out. I don't have a crystal ball, but it looks like it has potential that if this story takes off, people will start believing it. And France may have to deny it and maybe even make the statement that Russia wants to hear, that they have no intention of sending troops to Ukraine. I'm Dr. K, a political scientist that looks at how information is shared. I've been talking about politics on social media for a while, and finally, others are catching on that you have to be where people get their information.